So I know that I am last, which is not an easy task at all. I know it's late. You were up all night watching the game. All those things. Go Wildcats. So my goal tonight, in the time that I have, and I'm watching the clock to be mindful of it, is to make it compelling, to make you want to have stayed, and tell everybody else, oh, I'm sorry you left. That's my goal, all right? So Patty gave me a very generous introduction, and what I really want to do tonight, in just terms of setting this discussion up, is just say to you that, for me, and it has always been this way, is millennials have already defined what the future of work is. And that really is the whole presentation. You could drop the mic and walk away, but I won't do that, because that would not have been worth coming and staying. But what I'll tell you is, and I really mean this, is that the generation that you heard a lot about today and the discussions that we had has really, hopefully got us really thinking about what is in front of us, and that the things that Generation Y wants are things that we probably have always wanted ourselves. And what I mean by that ourselves, meaning Gen X, boomers, traditionalists, and the like. So what I'm going to attempt to do is to take you through a conversation in so many slides, and hopefully get you to talk to me about what questions you have. Because we've heard some great content from some great speakers. I sat in all the rooms, and things that I've heard in my head, which is not always a good thing, but they're like rattling up there, were said in the room. So I'm also going to try not to be redundant, but also emphasize what was really important and compelling. So I'll just do this very quickly as a setup. Here are the takeaways from today, right? So the takeaways are encourage collaboration, increase flexibility, change in technology, and diversity in generations. We've talked about that ad nauseum today. And that's a good thing, because what it hopefully has given you a sense of is the framework for which the future of work is going to look like means that all those things have to be realized. So what I'm going to hopefully share with you today a little bit about is, for me, the time that I spent at Abercrombie & Fitch was, as Patty mentioned, a simple task, one that required me to report to our chairman, our CEO. So, a job that when you're sitting there from, an individual who you have to learn how to work with and manage up, who comes from a completely different generational group, a traditionalist, 70 or so odd individual. All of those things also fuel how you have the conversation about what matters. So what I want you to think about tonight is, in these slides as we go through the dialogue, is when you think about who you are and who you represent, is your organization promoting organizational transparency, one? Two, is there authenticity? And Imogen and Carla talked about that earlier. So is there authenticity, is there not, among your leadership team? You also have to ask yourself, is there this sense of being persistent about creating an environment where good ideas matter? And not that profit does not, but that those good ideas are what fuels people to come back to work every day. Also, you want to think about, am I creating an environment that's optimistic? And I give you those questions as context because, for me, and what I'll hope to tell you when we're done, is that those 4 buckets are the buckets in which the future of work is built on. Those are the pillars as I see it. And for me, and I had this very unique experience, right? And that was when I walked into ANF, and it was 2004, there was a gentleman by the name of Eduardo Gonzalez. All of this is Googleable, so I'm not telling you anything that you can't know. He and 8 of his friends, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, decided to put forward this massive lawsuit about race, ethnicity, gender discrimination, all those good things. But what it meant to me when I walked in was, not only is this going to be a job about trying to figure out how do you create an initiative that doesn't exist and reporting to an organizational structure that is going to have its challenges, none of which I knew certainly then. In hindsight, I do. But what it also meant was that generation, this generation that we're talking about, demanded change. And they demanded it in a way that was non-negotiable. So there wasn't going to be a question about, well, should we do this or not? The reality is we have to. Because for them, and a lot of this you heard Andy talk about it and others, the whole sense of connected technology for them was building this sense of there's a global community out there and I want to get to know who they are. They're going to become my friends on Facebook. They're going to become, my social community. In fact, Twitter, actually, when I started, wasn't even live, right? So if I think back about the years. So all of those things were starting to happen and come together. And as a result of as they came together, this generation was saying, we are looking at respect and inclusion as, again, basic fundamentals. The shift was seismic in that this generational group was very mindful of things that, again, now, with the ability of having hindsight, that issues around marriage equality, issues around, and they're listed there, dating, outside of their quote-unquote racial and ethnic group, were things that were becoming more commonly discussed, and what some people might consider fringe issues are now, for them, were mainstream. But back then, we didn't know that. We didn't have that good sense of where they were headed. We have the benefit now looking back and saying, as those things happened, as those things were kind of coming together, that was what their world was looking like. It was a world for them that was essentially growing up with expanding issues around human rights. All those things, for them, again, changed automatically overnight, gradually speaking, but made us as managers, whatever you might be, boomer, traditionalist, and probably made you frustrated because you're trying to figure out, who are they? Like, why is this happening? What they were giving us an indication of early on was that they wanted to see things differently. And when I took the role, and you have the gift of the book, thank you to Bethany and Villanova, there are, and I'll try to go into the book and what it's about, but what essentially it says is, for me, that journey, that personal story of working alongside them for so long, not only changed my life, my perspective, but it made me realize that they were the dancing man that we saw earlier tonight, because they were doing things and coming together as a community, and in some ways, in some shapes and form, I didn't even know what was happening. I didn't know that we were going to one day be 52% non-white, which, as Patty talked about, was significant. Even more so, why it was significant was when I started that role, we had 700 stores, 40,000 employees. What we ended up with when that change happened was more than 1,000 stores and more than 100,000 employees. So that percentage change didn't just happen overnight on constant, movement. It was continual growth. So you're not only adding more people to the pie, if you will, but you're doing it in a way that now you have to think about what your behavior looks like, because you have to do things differently. So I'll try to dive into some of those things as I give you some context. So for me, when I think about, oh boy, look at that. 1, 2, 3. For me, the world according to millennials is clearly locked into 4 buckets. Transparency, the word that you've heard already today, authenticity, persistence, and optimism. And I'll define them very quickly just to give you some context. From the transparency piece, here's a generation that basically said, as I think about growing up and how connective technology has changed me, and if me being a millennial, if I'm given that answer, for me, I'm now thinking about, when you come to me about an assignment, a project, a workflow issue, you can't just say, can you get this done by 3:30, on Friday? Like, what's behind that? What is the real reason why we're doing this? Because I'm already suspicious about information that you're withholding from me, because I can Google it and figure out from a fact check whether or not you tell me the truth or not. And some of you are smiling because some of that is probably very real. So for me, what I got to know about them very clearly was transparency mattered an awful lot. It was the new normal. From the authenticity piece, it's a group that basically said, I would rather you honestly disagree with me versus than you dishonestly agree. And do we know what that means? It means you just can't nod your head and say yes and not mean it, or go like this with your finger on the book. You can't do that. Because the reality is for them, you lost all credibility. And what I got to know very intimately, alongside of these, millennials who were not only being really bold inside a brand that had its own identity, some days for the better, some days for the worse, but had its own identity nonetheless. It had me really begin to think about that things can change, but they're going to have to change with an expectation that things have to look a certain way. And you can't just, expect people to say, at the end of the day, well, it's going to be this way, and that's what it's going to, mean for us, and not have something behind it, not have a meaning. Third, the issue of being persistent. Now, this whole thought about continuous improvement, and we've heard about it from some of the other presentations that we heard tonight, is a big deal, and is a big deal, in that there's no finish line. There's no end state that says, oh, we've got the product all launched, it's ready to go, we're done, because at the end of the day, they're trying to think about how do you make it better. I mean, if you look at your phones, how do they get thinner? It's funny, I was talking to somebody who mentioned, and I remembered actually now when I thought about it, the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas. Okay, some of you know that. So he was walking down the sand with a phone like that was like big as an arm, right? So the reality is that symbol acknowledges the fact that things change over time. So for this generational perspective to really latch on, you've got to understand that. You've got to allow that to be their reality. But you also have to allow it to be yours, because that's the future of work. The future of work is that. The future of work is also about optimism, meaning there's a sense of openness that has to happen, because again, if they've grown up with this whole notion of technology connecting them as a community, they're not going to think about, well, how come I cannot have friendships or relationships with people who look different than me? That's not acceptable. And as I kind of dial that back and think about it, those four pieces together, for me, for you, hopefully, translates into, well, the future of work is that. I mean, we all want, and honestly, if we did a poll, I'm sure we'd hopefully get a lot of hands up. We all want transparency. Yes, we'd agree. We all want authenticity. We all kind of want to continue to learn and be persistent about what's next and how do I become great or greater. And we all want to be optimistic. I mean, if you think about the news cycle, who doesn't want to be optimistic when you hear the news? I mean, who wants to, kind of get lost in that, stuff and think about, oh my gosh, is it really that bad? Is it really going to happen that way? Let's hope not. So for me, those four things were monumental experiences. And they were, things that really began to make me think about things differently. In the book, there's this character, he's a real guy, named Carlos, who I spent time with getting to know, and he wasn't an ANF associate, but he's a millennial, Mexican-American, Harvard-educated, parents are very, very, traditional. He was asked to be part of this Y20 summit. The Y20 summit is the junior version, the young people version, if you will, of the G20. His goal, among 100 other people who were invited around the world, was to think about what kind of things can you change. They're talking about issues around poverty, water filtration issues. They're talking about homelessness, young girls who might be married off to an elder man in their community, all the big issues. And why that was powerful of a story for him to share with me, what I put in the book, really made me realize that for him and his generation, that's what they're looking to do. They're looking to make changes. And it doesn't mean that boomers didn't try to make changes, when you think about, the civil rights movement, but this is different in that these things are on larger scale. These things also involve a lot more people and affect, the world in a way that it did not necessarily do before, because we have the benefit of social media, the benefit of news, the benefit of all these other platforms that make everybody want to know what's going on. So for me, I think we all need to think about how this generation is looking for us to not bend toward exclusion. And what I can tell you in a very intimate way and personal way is the time that I spent at ANF reminded me of that. Because as I thought about my journey and as I was writing the book, which was, by the way, therapeutic, so if you want therapy, write a book. You don't have to publish it, but just write it. But it was therapy because it made me reflect on the people that I met, like Patty and others, about what was important to them and what they were going to really lock in on and what they were going to do to make a difference. So, and I'm going to try to bring it together and wrap it up and maybe open it up for questions. If the future of work has arrived, which I believe it has, then we have to think about the context of three things. How do we begin to start to ask for forgiveness rather than for permission? How do we think about, identifying headwinds and crosswinds, meaning those things that happen inside of our companies or our brands or our organizations that might get in the way or make you get stuck? And how do we find an unlikely group of friends? Before I give you the definition of what those mean, on the back of the book, and his name came up in a session, Neil Howe, who has done tremendous amount of research around generational issues. I got to know him, in the course of writing the book, and sat down with him. We talked about some of the ideas and the stories at ANF and what happened. And he supported the book by writing a little blurb on the back. But what it reminded me of is the impact that young people have on really making things move. And although we sometimes might think that it's kind of like very lofty, he reminded me in the research that he's done that that's where they're trying to aspire. But they're not trying to necessarily be ordinary and kind of just coexist, because that would be a waste of time. Because at the end of the day, you only get one shot at making a difference. I have this song in my head, Eminem, Lose Yourself. I don't know why that came up. Google it. It's actually pretty cool. But so back to this. The point is, if we're trying to maximize the future of work, and we're trying to make sure that we embrace what's in front of us, for this whole notion about asking for forgiveness rather than permission, what I mean by that is set up your environment, make sure that you yourself even think about taking calculated risks. Be bold and try to do things that move the needle. Andy had a point in his session about Uber and Airbnb. And now, here are young men who founded a company, didn't ask for permission, I'm sure. They're just like, we're going to just do this. Created an entire new industry. I mean, think about it. On the premise of you're going to get in somebody's car who you don't know, it's not a yellow cab, in a city perhaps that you've never been to, you're going to stay in a room with somebody that you're like, who are you? So all those things have this fundamental belief that, you can do something that's different. The irony in all of that is that those two industries or those two brands represent this whole notion of what inclusion to me means, which is the reason why those brands are successful is that there's this common belief that you've got to have familiarity, comfort, and trust with the process of doing something different. What I mean by that is you would never jump in a car on a Honda Accord, whatever it might be, and I'm knocking the brand, but not a yellow cab. Or you certainly would not necessarily stay in a house or a room down the street in a city or a country that you've never been to unless you were, one, either very familiar or comfortable or you trusted the process. So the whole notion of inclusion not only bleeds, into how you show up at work, but it also can, revolutionize industries and make things look and feel a little bit differently, if that makes sense. So, on that notion of forgiveness and permission, think about, can you do that? You also need to think about this whole notion of identifying headwinds and crosswinds. And what I mean by that is inside of your organization that you represent, maybe even on a personal level, you might say, there is change needing to happen tomorrow, but no one wants to get there. So you got to start to figure out where that resistance is coming from. Certainly inside of a brand, that I'm speaking of, there was some of that resistance. There were pockets of how do you, move people along a discussion and a continuum of change has to happen. You don't move from 90% white to 50-some-odd% non-white, add 400 stores, add new brands by just sitting there saying no. You've got to figure out where your allies are because there are many. Now, some may be more powerful than others, but then you've got to figure out how do you survive here for 10 years and get around some of that, stuff. It's doable. But it also makes you think about, when I do that and I create those allies, I'm also going to now figure out how do I eliminate the blind spots. Those things that kind of get in your way of making a decision because now you've recognized by working with someone else, you've got a better perspective that because you've missed something because now, John and I are friendly and I never thought about his perspective until now. So that whole notion of being collaborative, being transparent and authentic, themes from today's conversation, all resonate. And again, for me, millennials have really already defined the blueprint for what the future of work looks like. On a final note on this slide and in this section, not like there are multiple chapters, by the way, it kind of came out that way. I know you're like, oh my gosh, we're almost done. So on the notion of finding unlikely friends, here's the thing. Again, the generational group that we're speaking of doesn't represent anything that we probably don't aspire to, go after. But for them, being around people who they didn't necessarily know well was okay. I mean, my son, who is not a millennial by any means, is a Gen Z. The threshold, and we talked about it, is kind of blurry right now. But, nonetheless, we've gone to churches, just to visit, to see what's going on in different fellowships, blah, blah, blah. He'll walk up to the choir stand and get a seat. Well, one, you can't sing. Two, you don't know anybody here. And three, if I stay, that means I have to pay tithes, which means put money in the pot. So, what are we doing? But my point is, with him, he's okay with that. He's okay with trying to be around people who are different, and he's okay with being uncomfortable when those situations may not always go so well. So the question to you is, tonight, among others, are you ready? Are you willing to do that? Because again, and I say it again, the future of work has already been clearly mapped out. This is where we're headed. We're not dialing it back. There's no, let's say, hey, we're going to go back to the 19X, fill in the blank. That's gone. So this whole notion of pushing forward requires you to be a bit more inclusive in how you think, and it also requires you to have, civility when you disagree. We don't have to talk about the political campaigns and all that other good stuff, but the discourse that you have to have now has to be above here. And you can disagree, and you can be around people who don't necessarily value your point of view, but can you have a discussion that at least leaves you feeling whole when you're all said and done? Because for me, my experience has been with them, and this is why I like talking about this generation so much, is because they remind me about how optimistic we should all really be. They also remind me about, that at the end of the day, all of those, negative tags, maybe some are true, I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of that. And I tell you because when I think about what I started with, which was a very challenging role and a challenging brand with its own history that became my history automatically, whether it be T-shirt designs that probably should have never seen the light of day or other things, I've got to now figure out how to make sure I challenge that so it doesn't happen on my watch. Because if it does, then that means I'm not doing something that I should do. Or if it happens, then I'm going to be comfortable having a discussion with CEO or stockroom associate that doesn't happen, it can't happen, because it's non-negotiable that it does. So this, and I just stuck these in, and then I started putting slides in. So if I was giving you a gift, a slide, I'd say, if you're trying to recruit, if you're trying to think about how do you use some of this, you might say, well, if I wanted to win the war of recruiting millennials, maybe I'll just start to hire on the spot, like when I find somebody that I really like. And I offer that because it's real simple for me. It shows the behavioral pattern that you're not really locked in to bureaucracy. And for millennials now, they're looking for that to happen, looking for you to be nimble. So if you've got to go back and ask 12 people if you like Patty, and those 12 people have to ask 3 more people, by the time you come back to Patty, she's got 3 offers, and all of a sudden, like, you lost out. So that whole notion of, like, how do you now behave differently matters, and you've got to think about how are you going to make your adjustments. Because quite often, we don't want to adjust. We kind of want to stick with what's normal, what we're used to, and what matters the most to us. You might want to also think about, how do I now tailor the letter or the pitch to get talent in the door? I mean, maybe I can start to identify motivators and things that really resonate with that generational group. And it could be something simple as, in the first 90 days, you'll be on a cross-functional team, and you'll have an opportunity to travel to a retreat. All those things are very different buzzwords, as opposed to, when you join the organization, we're going to have orientation, and after orientation, there's going to be a 30-day, probation period. What? I'm out. Or I'm not even coming. So how do you start to talk to people in a very different way? And again, that came up in one of the sessions earlier, but how do you have communication with different generational groups so that you've connected with them? And you also might think about, how do I help develop someone's brand? And sometimes that's a scary thought, because for us, we think that if I'm trying to develop someone's brand, then maybe that means I'm trying to lose them. Why? All it might mean is that they're going to rotate inside your organization and find out something else to do. Or they're going to come up with another idea and contribute to the bottom line later on in another way. So those are the kind of things I just want you to think about in a way of hopefully being more bold and more deliberate. I didn't pause, and I know that I should have. Questions so far before I kind of take us to wrap up? We can do it now, we can do it later, but I'm good. No? Okay, that means you guys want to go drink. Yes, I'm sorry. So the question is, how do you do these things day to day? For me, it was continually auditing things. So, for example, I might audit behavior in a room in terms of, are people approaching a problem with what I call non-judgmental inquiry, meaning are they asking the question for curiosity's sake to try to get to a better answer, or are they kind of digging to kind of get you? Like, oh, I got him. He got the wrong answer. Because if you start to audit those little small nuances, then you have a better idea of what is a company ready to accept or not accept. Because if it's okay to ask a question with the assumption that I want to get you in a position where you're now vulnerable and you're wrong, that's an unhealthy place to be. It's not a place that I want to be. And you got to figure out, well, how do I get to that behavior that's more inclusive and says, I'm trying to get to a notion of, we want you to ask the question for the sake of the question being asked, and how can we all learn? Because if you go back to the principles of transparency, authenticity, persistence, and optimism, what's anchored in that is that, they're trying to continually learn and be better. We should try to create that environment for them. Because again, at the end of the day, we probably want it as well. Does that help? One of the stories that I'll tell you, and I promise to close it out soon, is we also had to audit the in-store experience. And what I mean by that is, when I joined the organization, all we really asked was when somebody walked through those doors, let's say that's a store, we asked on the premise of male or female what your shopping experience was. Okay, that's fine, but it doesn't give me the answer to how Black, Hispanic, Asian feel when they walk into the store. So then we started to require, in quotes, suggest strongly as a mystery shopper who would be a third-party vendor sending us people to test the experience. What is it we want you to now select whether or not you are Black, male, Hispanic, male, Asian, female, whatever it might be, because I can now get a better gauge of if those different diversity dimensions walk into a store, whether or not they're feeling included or not. And if there's a gap, meaning white male gets great experience as a 10, Hispanic female gets not so good experience as a 5, then that store's got a challenging issue that I've got to figure out. Because the question of, in the first 15 seconds when that person walks in the door, they should all get the tagline, they should all be greeted the same way, they should all be allowed to take back the same amount of products into the fitting room. All of those things are subtle nuances that you change or you try to check and correct every day. So those are things you got to figure out. Because if you think about that, and this is a Deloitte study, by the way, and I didn't say this, but that little Fitch path thing on the bottom, little icon, is the page in the book that quote or fact comes from. So you can mark it up, it's yours. I think actually you can have it. So the whole notion about engagement is a big deal for them. A big deal in a way that really makes them want to show up or not show up. And if you're thinking about your future of work, challenge, are you creating that for people in your organization? Because again, it's non-negotiable. I mean, we're not trying to say, well, maybe this is a good idea. This is the new normal. This is what has to happen. And so I think this is almost my last slide. So for me, this whole notion and this whole discussion about the future of work, which is really locked in on transparency, authenticity, persistence, and optimism, also by the name, by the way, TAPO, which is the name of the consultancy that I founded when I left, ANF, was focused on those principles. Because if you can start to examine in a really critical way, you can prepare today's leaders to be, phenomenal. Because you already have the blueprint of what this generational group wants. We talked about it a lot tonight about what the future of work looks like. What I'm going to challenge you to do is to think about, does your organization have transparency? Do you have a way of promoting authenticity among your leadership team? Are you really focused on, getting people to have really good ideas, not necessarily, always having a profitable one, but one that makes somebody feel connected to what's going on? And is there this sense of optimism that makes somebody want to come back? So, on that notion, if there are questions that you have before we wrap up, I'm happy to take them. If not, we can certainly do that at the networking group. But I could not have one of these two. So that's my contribution to the Wildcats, which was a great game. So thank you very much.
So we are so excited.